Hey guys, tonight we start with completely stupid medieval trends that got people killed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with one of medieval Europe's greatest achievements in the field of self-sabotage. The majestic, unnecessary, and occasionally lethal poulain. These were shoes with extremely long, narrow toes that curled upward like they were trying to ask a question. And when I say long, I do not mean slightly dramatic. I mean long enough to make you question whether the cobbler was paid by the inch. Some extended several inches beyond the actual foot. In more extreme cases, the toe had to be tied to the wearer's leg with a string so it wouldn't swing around like an overconfident leather antenna. Why would anyone willingly wear this? Status. The longer your shoe, the higher your rank. It was medieval math. If your toes reached impressive distances, you were clearly important. If your shoes allowed you to walk normally, congratulations, you were poor. Now imagine navigating a medieval city. Streets covered in mud, straw, animal contributions, and whatever else the neighbours felt like discarding. Cobblestones were uneven, stairs were steep, markets were crowded. Add horses, carts, and the occasional goat with no sense of personal boundaries. Into this chaos walked nobles wearing footwear designed by someone who clearly had never encountered gravity. Running? Not happening. Quickly turning around? Ambitious? Avoiding a puddle, a high-stakes gamble. Tripping was common, falling was humiliating. Falling in public while dressed as a peacock with extended toes. Legendary. And medieval crowds were not known for forming polite circles and asking if you were okay. If you went down, people stepped over you. Or on you. Possibly both. Now, here's the dangerous part. In emergencies, fires, riots, sudden fights, mobility mattered. A broken leg today is inconvenient. A broken leg in the Middle Ages was an extended appointment with infection and regret. Medicine was limited. Sanitation was theoretical. Even authorities noticed this had gone too far. Some regions tried limiting toe length because things were getting absurd. Not because they cared about safety, but because fashion had officially left reality and entered comedy. And yet people persisted. Because looking powerful mattered more than being able to move. The poulain was essentially a public announcement that said, "I am so wealthy, I will never need to flee danger." Unfortunately, medieval life had a habit of disagreeing, and so the humble shoe, a device invented to protect your feet, occasionally became the reason you needed protecting in the first place. Fashion, it turns out, has always been brave, and sometimes very, very stupid. If medieval fashion had a motto, it would have been beauty first, survival optional. Pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. It meant you didn't work in the fields. You weren't exposed to the sun. You were delicate, refined, and ideally fainting somewhere near a castle window. Tanned skin meant labour. Pale skin meant luxury. So naturally, people asked the most logical question possible. How can I make myself even paler? The answer, unfortunately, was lead. Lead-based cosmetics became wildly popular among nobles, particularly women, who applied thick white pastes made from lead compounds directly onto their faces. The result was a porcelain, ghost-like complexion that screamed aristocracy and whispered mild poisoning. At first, it worked beautifully. The skin looked smooth, flawless, luminous. People admired it, complimented it, probably asked for the recipe. But lead is not known for its moisturizing properties. Over time, the skin began to crack. Sores developed. Hair fell out. Teeth loosened. Some users experienced tremors, mood swings, seizures, and slow neurological decline. Organs quietly began reconsidering their life choices. And what was the solution when the skin deteriorated from lead damage? More lead. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, My house is on fire. Let's fix it with gasoline. Chronic lead poisoning is not subtle. It causes fatigue, abdominal pain, cognitive decline, and eventually organ failure. But because the symptoms developed gradually, people often blamed anything except the cosmetic they were smearing onto their faces daily. Bad humours, evil spirits, bad air, mercury in retrograde. Anything but the literal heavy metal being absorbed through their skin. The irony is remarkable. In a time when plagues were common and medicine was questionable, some members of the upper class voluntarily introduced a toxic substance into their bloodstream because it made them look a little more fashionable. And here's the part that makes it almost impressive. They stuck with it. The look mattered more than the consequences. Status over safety, aesthetic over anatomy. Because in medieval society looking fragile and ethereal was desirable, actually becoming fragile and ethereal, less ideal. But by the time they realized that glowing like a haunted candle might not be healthy, the damage was already done. Fashion has always had risks. In the Middle Ages, it just came with long-term neurological side effects. If medieval medicine had a favourite hobby, it was removing blood. Headache, too much blood. Fever, clearly too much blood. Feeling slightly sad on a Tuesday? Blood, definitely blood. The dominant medical theory of the time revolved around the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant these humours were out of balance. And if you had too much blood, which, statistically speaking, you always did, the logical solution was to take some out. Thus, bloodletting became the medieval equivalent of rebooting your system. Except instead of turning something off and on again, they drained you like a suspicious wine barrel. Barbers, not just physicians, performed the procedure. That iconic red and white barber pole. It symbolises blood and bandages. So the next time you get a haircut, just be grateful nobody suggests a small vein opening for balance. Bloodletting was done using lancets or leeches. Leeches were particularly popular because they looked official and did not require steady hands. The problem, of course, is that losing blood when you are already weak is not always a strategic move. Patients suffering from infections, dehydration, or malnutrition were routinely drained further. Sometimes modestly, sometimes aggressively. There are documented cases of patients losing so much blood that they fainted, went into shock, or simply never recovered. The medieval mindset was persistent. If you didn't improve after the first session, perhaps you needed more blood removed. It is a bold strategy, rarely successful. Even powerful figures weren't immune to this trend. Kings and nobles were bled for everything from colds to stress. Some historians believe that excessive bloodletting contributed to the decline or death of notable individuals. Imagine ruling a kingdom while your physician periodically reduces your operating capacity. What makes this especially tragic is that the intention was sincere. Physicians genuinely believed they were restoring balance. They weren't reckless. They were confidently wrong. And in an era where infection was already a lurking threat, opening veins with unsterilized instruments was not exactly helpful. Bloodletting persisted for centuries. It was respected, trusted, taught. And in countless cases, it quietly made sick people weaker, until weakness became fatal. Sometimes the most dangerous trends are not dramatic. They are simply accepted. And in medieval medicine, accepted often meant deeply unfortunate. Now we arrive at one of the boldest medical decisions in human history: trepanation. If you had migraines, seizures, depression, confusion, or what medieval society classified as acting unusual, there was a very real chance someone would suggest drilling a hole into your skull. Yes, a hole. The theory was simple. Illness, especially mental illness, was often blamed on evil spirits, trapped pressure, or corrupted humours. And if something was trapped inside your head, the solution was obvious. Give it an exit. Enter the trepanation procedure. A practitioner would shave part of your head, take a specialised drill or chisel, and manually bore through the skull. No modern anaesthesia, no sterile surgical suite. Just determination, questionable hygiene, and a prayer. Now, to be fair, trepanation did sometimes succeed. Archaeologists have found skulls showing signs of healing around the drilled opening, meaning some patients survived. That is impressive. It is also deeply unsettling. But survival did not mean comfort. Infection was common. Brain trauma was possible. And if the practitioner drilled too deep or too enthusiastically, the procedure could become a very final event. What makes this especially tragic is that trepanation wasn't always a desperate last resort. In some areas it was a respected treatment. Headaches, drill. Epilepsy, drill. Personality changes, definitely drill. Imagine having a bad day and someone calmly suggesting, perhaps your skull requires ventilation. And in an age without microscopes, without germ theory, and without the faintest understanding of neurology, people placed extraordinary faith in this practice. The idea that drilling into bone might not be ideal rarely entered the conversation. Trepanation had existed since prehistoric times, but in the medieval period it became woven into the broader tapestry of medical experimentation. It was dramatic. It felt proactive. It looked like action. And that, perhaps, was part of its appeal. Because when faced with suffering, humans prefer doing something, even if that something involves a rotating metal instrument near the brain. In rare cases, pressure from head trauma might actually have been relieved by the procedure. But for many others, the cure was far worse than the condition. The medieval world did not lack courage. It simply lacked boundaries. And sometimes that combination led directly to the operating table, which was usually just a table. If you think modern legal systems are flawed, allow me to introduce medieval trial by ordeal, a method of determining innocence that relied less on evidence and more on endurance. Accused of theft. Wonderful. Suspected of heresy. Even better. Time to prove your innocence by holding a red-hot iron bar. Yes, that was an actual procedure. The logic was simple and terrifying. God would protect the innocent. So if you could carry a glowing piece of iron for several steps without your wounds becoming infected, you were declared innocent. If your hand blistered, festered, or failed to heal properly after a few days, congratulations, divine judgment had spoken. The problem? Burns tend to burn. Another popular version involved boiling water. The accused would plunge their hand into a pot and retrieve a stone from the bottom. Then the wound was bandaged and inspected days later. Clean healing meant innocence. Infection meant guilt. It was less a trial and more a medieval obstacle course designed by someone who hated palms. Then there was trial by water. The accused was bound and thrown into a body of water. If you floated, it meant the water, symbolically pure, rejected you. Therefore, guilty. If you sank, the water accepted you. Innocent. Of course, sinking while tied up is not a long-term survival strategy. So sometimes innocence came with unfortunate side effects. What makes this trend particularly dangerous is how normalized it became. Entire communities gathered to witness ordeals. Clergy blessed the rituals. It felt official. Sacred even. There were no juries debating evidence, no forensic investigations, no cross-examinations. Just faith, fire, and extremely uncomfortable water. Some historians argue that priests occasionally manipulated outcomes or avoided truly lethal extremes. Perhaps. But even under controlled conditions, burns, infections, and drowning were very real possibilities. And here is the unsettling part. People believed in it. They believed God would intervene physically in a courtroom demonstration involving hot metal. And in a world where divine will explained everything from weather to war, this logic did not feel outrageous. But belief does not neutralize physics. Fire burns, water suffocates, infection spreads. Trial by ordeal eventually faded as legal systems evolved, but for centuries justice was determined by how well your skin healed. And that is one courtroom trend we are very fortunate to have retired. Now let's talk about one of the strangest episodes in medieval history. The dancing plagues. Yes, that is a real phrase. In several European towns, Groups of people suddenly began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Not for an hour, not for a festival, for days, sometimes weeks. It often started with one person. A woman in Strasbourg in the early 15th century reportedly began dancing in the street with no music, no celebration, just commitment. Within days, dozens joined her, then hundreds. They danced without rest, without rhythm, without apparent reason. And here is where it becomes dangerous. They could not stop. Exhaustion set in. Dehydration followed. Some collapsed. Some suffered heart attacks or strokes. There are reports of people literally dancing until they died. Now imagine living in that town. You wake up, look outside, and half your neighbours are flailing in the street like a festival no one planned. Do you join? Do you avoid eye contact? Do you move? Many joined. Historians debate the cause. Mass hysteria, stress-induced psychosis, ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, religious fervour, a combination of all of the above. But regardless of the cause, the trend spread through suggestion and social contagion. In an age of intense religious fear, famine, disease, and instability, the human mind was already under immense strain. Add collective panic, and you get something that looks supernatural. Authorities responded in the most medieval way possible. They hired musicians. The theory was that the dancers needed to dance it out, so they built stages and encouraged the movement, hoping it would resolve itself. This did not improve survival rates. The body has limits. Muscles tear. Hearts fail. Sleep deprivation destabilizes everything. What began as an episode of psychological crisis became a physical one. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Humans are deeply susceptible to group behavior. When everyone around you reacts a certain way, it becomes harder to resist. The dancing plague was not stupidity in the usual sense. It was something more unsettling. It showed how fragile the boundary is between individual control and collective panic. No swords, no poison, no fashion, just momentum. And in the Middle Ages, momentum alone could be deadly. Now let's talk about medieval weekend entertainment, because when a knight in shining armour tells you he's going to play a game, what he actually means is full-speed collision with a sharpened stick. Tournaments were wildly popular across medieval Europe. Jousting, melee combat, mass cavalry charges. It was spectacle, sport, and status rolled into one very dangerous package. Nobles gathered, crowds cheered, banners waved dramatically in the wind. It looked glorious. It was also barely controlled violence. In a joust, two armoured knights charged at each other on horseback, each aiming a heavy wooden lance directly at the other's torso. The goal was to shatter the lance on impact, or knock your opponent off his horse. Sounds manageable, except horses weigh around half a ton. Add two armoured men accelerating toward each other with long poles, and you have physics doing what physics does best, ignoring your noble birth. Armour helped, but it was not magical. Lances splintered into jagged shards that pierced visors. Riders fell awkwardly and snapped their necks. Horses collided and crushed men beneath them. Internal bleeding was common. Concussions were practically a participation award. And that was just the joust. The melee, essentially a large group free-for-all, was even worse. Knights would clash in chaotic team battles, swinging maces and swords with alarming enthusiasm. Visibility inside a helmet was limited. Coordination was optimistic at best. Some tournaments blurred the line between sport and actual warfare. Rivalries turned personal. Blows got harder. Safety became optional. Even kings were not immune. Several high-ranking nobles and monarchs were injured or killed during tournaments, proving that even divine right does not protect you from blunt force trauma. Why risk it? Honour, fame, spectacle, and the very medieval belief that public displays of martial skill were essential to noble identity. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also status. And in medieval society, status was oxygen. So men strapped on 80 pounds of metal, mounted a warhorse, and charged at another human being for applause. Because nothing says sophisticated civilization quite like scheduled, crowd-funded concussions. Now let's shift from armoured chaos to something quieter, something slower, something that killed not with impact, but with absence. Food. In certain noble and religious circles of the later medieval period, thinness became associated with discipline, purity, and moral superiority. Fasting was originally a spiritual practice, a temporary denial of pleasure to focus on devotion. But like many human behaviours, moderation quietly left the room. Extended fasting became a display of virtue. The less you ate, the holier you appeared. And if you were a noblewoman navigating a court obsessed with status and image, restraint became performance. In some cases, extreme fasting was praised as evidence of divine favour. Stories circulated of women who survived on little more than prayer and tiny scraps of bread. Their weakness was reframed as spiritual strength. Unfortunately, the human body does not negotiate with symbolism. Chronic malnutrition weakens the immune system. It disrupts hormones. It damages organs. In a world already plagued by disease, famine, and questionable hygiene, voluntarily weakening yourself was not exactly strategic. Thinness also became fashionable in certain aristocratic settings. Pale, delicate, almost fragile. A body that looked untouched by manual labour signalled wealth. You were not working in fields. You were refined, elevated. You were also potentially one bad infection away from collapse. Without proper nutrition, wounds healed slowly. Illness lingered. Minor sicknesses became major threats. Women in particular suffered long-term health consequences, especially during pregnancy. The body cannot sustain life well when it barely sustains itself, and yet the social pressure was powerful. In tight-knit noble courts, reputation was survival. Appear weak, pious, restrained, and you were admired. Appear indulgent, and you risked judgment. It was not stupidity, it was incentive. When virtue, beauty, and status align with self-denial, people comply, even if compliance costs them years of their lives. So while peasants struggled against famine, they did not choose. Some elites embraced restriction voluntarily, all for holiness, image, and control. A tragic irony. Now let's enter the medieval basement laboratory. The candles are flickering. The air smells faintly of sulphur. And someone is absolutely convinced they are one experiment away from eternal life. Alchemy was not originally foolish. In fact, many early alchemists laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. They studied metals, reactions, distillation, and mineral properties with genuine curiosity. The problem was not curiosity. The problem was confidence. The ultimate goal of alchemy was the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could supposedly turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. And in a society obsessed with wealth, divine favour, and avoiding death, that promise was irresistible. So people experimented, at home, with mercury, arsenic, sulphur, lead vapours, strange mineral powders scraped from questionable places, mixtures heated in fragile glass containers over open flames, in poorly ventilated rooms. What could possibly go wrong? Mercury poisoning alone caused tremors, paranoia, hallucinations, and organ failure. Arsenic exposure led to vomiting, convulsions, and a very uncomfortable final chapter. Fumes built up, containers exploded, fires started. Curious apprentices inhaled things no human lungs were designed to meet. And yet, the dream persisted, because imagine the reward. Infinite gold, eternal youth, secret knowledge hidden from kings and priests. It was the medieval version of a startup pitch. High risk, unlimited upside, minimal understanding of consequences. Some rulers even funded alchemists, hoping to fill royal treasuries without taxes. When experiments failed, which they almost always did, accusations of fraud followed. And in medieval Europe, being accused of fraud while surrounded by flammable chemicals was not ideal for career longevity. The tragedy is that alchemy wasn't entirely misguided. It was proto-science tangled in mysticism. But when theory outruns safety, people get hurt. The quest for immortality often delivered the opposite. Instead of gold, they produced toxic smoke. Instead of eternal life, they shortened the one they had. All in the name of unlocking nature's secrets with a hammer, a crucible, and remarkable optimism. If alchemy was dangerous in the basement, medieval medicine was dangerous everywhere else. Because when people got sick, and they got sick often, they turned to cures that sounded impressive, expensive, and occasionally horrifying. The medieval pharmacy was less of a regulated institution and more of a creative writing exercise. Potions were made from ground metals, crushed gemstones, animal bile, powdered bones, and herbs collected by someone who was either knowledgeable or very optimistic. Mercury was swallowed. Arsenic was dissolved in tonics. Antimony was prescribed as a purifying agent, which is a polite way of saying it made you violently ill. But that was the point. If it hurt, it must be working. Many remedies were based on the theory of balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you felt feverish, you were too hot. If you were sad, you were too melancholic. The solution? Ingest something dramatic enough to shock your body back into harmony. Sometimes that shock was permanent. Snake oil is not a modern invention. Travelling healers sold miracle elixirs in crowded marketplaces, promising vitality, fertility, longevity, and relief from nearly everything. In a world without antibiotics, people were desperate. Desperation lowers standards. And so they drank. They drank metallic concoctions that damaged organs. They consumed spoiled mixtures contaminated with bacteria. They trusted mysterious ingredients because the label sounded authoritative. If it had a Latin name, it must be legitimate. Occasionally, herbal remedies genuinely helped. Medieval medicine was not entirely clueless, but the lack of dosage control, sanitation, and scientific testing meant that even good intentions could turn lethal. The cruel irony is that many illnesses might have resolved on their own with rest and hydration. Instead, patients added poison to the equation and complicated matters significantly. It was not stupidity. It was limited knowledge combined with urgency. When survival feels uncertain, hope becomes powerful, and hope, in a bottle, is hard to resist. Unfortunately, hope mixed with heavy metals tends to have side effects. In medieval Europe, sometimes the illness killed you, and sometimes the cure simply refused to wait its turn. Now we arrive at one of the darkest trends of all. Not fashion, not medicine, not sport, fear. In medieval Europe, when crops failed, livestock died, storms destroyed harvests, or illness swept through villages, people searched for explanations. And when science is limited, explanations become imaginative. If milk curdled unexpectedly, someone must have cursed it. If a child fell ill, someone must have whispered something unnatural. If a storm arrived at the wrong time, surely someone had angered heaven. That someone was often labelled a witch. Witch accusations spread like wildfire through tightly knit communities. Suspicion required very little evidence. An argument with a neighbour, a strange personality, knowledge of herbs, living alone, being different. Different was dangerous. Once accused, defending yourself was nearly impossible. Trials relied on superstition rather than proof. If you floated when thrown into water, you were guilty. If you sank and drowned, you were innocent. A flawless legal system. Under torture, confessions appeared quickly. People admitted to flying at night, consorting with demons, spoiling crops, anything to end the pain. And those confessions fueled more accusations. Mass paranoia became a social contagion. Communities convinced themselves they were protecting order. In reality, they were dismantling it. Skilled healers were executed. Elderly women were burned. Outsiders were hanged. Fear turned neighbours into judges. The tragedy is that witch hunts were not random chaos. They were organised, structured, and justified by authority. Religious leaders and local officials often endorsed them. Fear, when validated by power, becomes lethal. And here's the unsettling part. Most of the accused were not criminals. They were simply vulnerable. Widows without protection, women without strong family ties, people already on the margins. The trend was suspicion. The currency was rumor. The consequence was fire. It was not medieval people being uniquely irrational. It was humans under stress, desperate for control in a world of plague, famine, and uncertainty. Blame feels safer than chaos, so entire communities convinced themselves they were purifying society, while destroying it. In the end, the deadliest force was not magic. It was fear, amplified by confidence and enforced by a crowd that believed it was doing the right thing. After fear, we moved to faith. Because in the medieval world, devotion was not casual. It was physical. It was public. And sometimes, it was fatal. Pilgrimages were incredibly popular. Thousands of people would travel long distances to visit holy sites, sacred shrines, relics of saints, miracle-working statues, tombs believed to radiate divine power. Places like Canterbury, Rome, Santiago, and countless smaller shrines drew waves of believers every year. The journey itself was considered an act of penance. Suffering equaled sincerity. Blisters meant holiness. The problem was scale. Roads were narrow. Infrastructure was minimal. Sanitation was, at best, optimistic. When thousands of travelers converged on one location, conditions deteriorated quickly. Food supplies ran thin. Water sources became contaminated. Illness spread effortlessly in packed hostels and roadside inns, and medieval illnesses did not politely wait their turn. Pilgrims often walked for weeks, exhausted and underfed. Injuries became infected. Minor fevers turned serious. Those already weakened by fasting or previous illness were especially vulnerable. What began as spiritual dedication sometimes ended in burial, far from home. Then there were the crowds. Shrines housing famous relics attracted massive gatherings. People pushed forward to touch a saint's bone, a fragment of cloth, a vial of supposed holy oil. In tightly packed spaces, stampedes occurred. Individuals were crushed against walls. Children were separated and trampled. Panic spreads quickly when movement stops, but pressure does not. And during plague years, the irony was devastating. Large religious gatherings became perfect environments for disease transmission. People travelled from distant regions, carrying pathogens with them, unknowingly spreading illness across entire kingdoms. None of this stopped the devotion. Because in a world defined by uncertainty, faith offered structure, hope, meaning. The belief that suffering on the road might protect you from suffering later. It was not foolishness. It was longing. But when thousands of desperate, exhausted people gather in confined spaces without sanitation or medical care, consequences follow. Spiritual ambition collided with biological reality. And sometimes, the road to salvation became far more dangerous than the life people were trying to escape. If pilgrimages were devotion on the move, flagellation was devotion turned inward. Very inward. During times of plague, famine, or social crisis, certain groups believed the only way to stop divine punishment was through physical suffering. If God was angry, the solution was simple. Hurt yourself until he noticed. Enter the flagellants. These were groups of men, and sometimes women, who travelled from town to town publicly whipping themselves. Bare backs, leather cords, iron-tipped lashes. They marched in processions, chanting hymns, striking their own skin until blood ran down their shoulders. It was dramatic. It was emotional. It was contagious. Crowds gathered to watch. Some joined. Others believed witnessing such intense repentance would shield them from disease. In an era ravaged by plague, when medicine had little to offer, visible suffering looked like action. And action feels better than helplessness. The problem was not just the pain. Open wounds in medieval Europe were invitations. Bacteria thrived. Flies were enthusiastic participants. Infection set in quickly. Repeated whipping reopened healing cuts. Fever followed. Weakness followed that. And remember, many of these processions occurred during plague outbreaks. Large groups moving between towns, bleeding openly, interacting closely, not exactly ideal for disease control. Church authorities eventually became uneasy. Some flagellant groups began claiming direct divine revelation, bypassing clergy authority entirely. That rarely ends well in medieval politics. But the deeper tragedy was psychological. These people were not thrill-seekers. They were terrified. The Black Death had torn through communities, killing family members within days. When death feels random and unstoppable, humans crave control. If suffering voluntarily could prevent suffering involuntarily, it seemed worth trying. Pain was reframed as purification, blood as bargaining. Unfortunately, bacteria do not respect symbolism. Flagellation did not stop plague. It often accelerated infection. It weakened already fragile bodies. It turned spiritual desperation into medical vulnerability. The intention was repentance. The result was trauma layered on top of catastrophe. In a world searching for answers, people chose the one thing they could control, their own flesh. And medieval microbes, as usual, were happy to participate. Now, let's talk about hunger, the kind that does not politely wait for better options. Famine was a recurring nightmare in medieval life. A bad harvest, prolonged rain, unexpected frost, or war disrupting trade could push entire regions into starvation within months. When grain supplies ran low, desperation replaced caution. And desperation has a very creative palate. People ate whatever they could find: tree bark, roots, wild grasses, spoiled meat, anything that resembled calories. But the real danger often came from something that looked completely ordinary: grain. Stored grain could become infected with a fungus called ergot. It grew quietly on rye and other cereals, especially in damp conditions. To the untrained eye, it simply looked like slightly darkened kernels. Grind it into flour, bake it into bread, and you had yourself a medieval chemical experiment. Ergot poisoning is not subtle. Victims experienced burning sensations in their limbs, violent convulsions, hallucinations, and severe muscle spasms. Fingers and toes sometimes turned black and died due to restricted blood flow. Entire villages suffered outbreaks of strange behavior: twitching, screaming, visions of demons or angels. In a deeply religious society, what do hallucinations look like? Curses, possession, divine punishment. Some historians believe certain episodes of mass hysteria and witch accusations may have been influenced by ergot-contaminated bread. Imagine entire communities unknowingly dosing themselves with a natural hallucinogen and then trying to interpret the results spiritually. It was not madness, it was mold. And famine made it worse. When food is scarce, you do not discard questionable grain. You scrape off the worst parts and pray the rest behaves. Starvation feels more immediate than potential poisoning. So families ate the bread, and sometimes they convulsed. The cruel irony is that these people were not chasing status or fashion. They were trying to survive, but survival under extreme scarcity forces terrible compromises. Hunger narrows judgment. It shifts risk tolerance. It makes probably safe sound good enough. In the end, famine was not just about lack of food. It was about vulnerability, about how quickly human bodies and communities unravel when resources disappear. They were not cursed. They were poisoned by fungus in the very bread meant to sustain them, and medieval Europe learned painfully that even the most basic staple of life can become a silent threat when conditions turn against you. And now we arrive at the final trend, the one that sits quietly beneath all the others. Status over survival. Pointy shoes that made you fall. Lead makeup that poisoned you. Starvation disguised as virtue. Tournaments that shattered bones. Alchemy that filled your lungs with metal fumes. Pilgrimages that spread disease. Flagellation that opened wounds. Witch hunts fueled by fear. Different symptoms. Same root. Humans cared deeply about belonging. In medieval society, status was not vanity. It was protection. Your clothing, your rituals, your public behavior, all of it signaled where you stood in the social hierarchy. and that hierarchy determined safety, opportunity, marriage prospects, alliances. If the elite wore absurdly long shoes, you wore them too. If pale skin meant nobility, you powdered your face. If fasting proved holiness, you fasted. If bravery required charging into a lance, you charged. Because not participating had consequences. Reputation could determine whether neighbours helped you during famine, whether a lord favoured you, whether a court respected you, whether suspicion fell on you during crisis. So people chose conformity, even when conformity was dangerous. This is the uncomfortable truth. Medieval society was not uniquely irrational. It was intensely human. Pride, fear, ambition, devotion. These forces have not changed. The details look dramatic in hindsight, but the mechanics are familiar. We still follow trends that harm us. We still prioritize image. We still trust confident voices over careful evidence. We still choose belonging over safety more often than we admit. The Middle Ages simply had sharper consequences. Without antibiotics, without sanitation, without reliable medicine, small mistakes became fatal. A broken bone became infection. A contaminated tonic became organ failure. A rumour became execution. And yet, people kept following the crowd. Because the need to belong is stronger than logic in almost every century. So perhaps the deadliest medieval trend was not the shoe, or the poison, or the lance. It was the belief that status was worth more than survival. And if we are honest, that may be the one trend humanity never quite abandoned. Now that we have survived tonight's tour of spectacularly bad decisions, let me know. Which one shocked you the most? And which one feels uncomfortably modern? Before it was sweet, before it melted on your tongue, before it became the comfort food of bad days and romantic gestures, cacao was something far more serious. It was money. Among the ancient Maya, cacao beans functioned as currency, not metaphorically. Literally. You could pay tribute with cacao. You could buy food, cloth, tools, even labour. A few beans might purchase a tamale. A larger pouch could secure a turkey for a feast. Wealth was counted not in gold coins, but in small, dark seeds that rattled inside woven bags. And because they were valuable, they were also carefully controlled. Regions with ideal growing conditions, humid lowlands with rich soil, became economically powerful. Trade routes stretched across the Yucatan Peninsula and into Central America, carrying cacao in bulk. Caravans moved it alongside obsidian, jade, feathers, and salt. Entire political alliances were strengthened through cacao exchange. But cacao was not just economic power. It was sacred power. In Mayan cosmology, cacao was believed to be a divine gift. Some myths describe it as discovered within a sacred mountain by the gods. Others link it to the maize god, a central figure of renewal, sacrifice, and rebirth. Cacao appears painted on ceramics, carved into stone, and referenced in glyphs. It was embedded in ritual life. Royal courts consumed it during ceremonies. Nobles drank it during political negotiations. Marriage rites sometimes included cacao offerings. Even burial goods have revealed cacao residues in elite tombs, suggesting it accompanied rulers into the afterlife. And here's the important detail. This was not dessert. Mayan cacao was bitter, frothy, spiced with chili, sometimes thickened with maize. There was no sugar, no milk, no sweetness to soften the edge. It was stimulating, sharp, earthy, more sacred elixir than indulgent treat. To drink cacao was to participate in something elevated, something ancient, something tied to gods and status. So when we think of chocolate today, wrapped in foil and sold at the checkout counter, it's worth remembering that its origin story is far older and far more powerful. For the Maya, cacao was not comfort food. It was currency. It was ceremony. It was civilization itself. If cacao was sacred, the way it was prepared mattered just as much as the bean itself. Mayan chocolate was not casually stirred in a cup. It was crafted. almost performed. The process began with fermentation and drying, then roasting the beans over open flame. Once roasted, they were cracked, peeled and ground on a stone matart into a thick, dark paste. The sound of stone against stone would have echoed through courtyards and kitchens, rhythmic and deliberate. But the real magic happened when water was added. The paste was mixed with water, sometimes maize, sometimes chili, occasionally flowers or herbs. Then came the most important step, the frothing. The liquid was poured back and forth between vessels from a height, sometimes waist level, sometimes higher, creating a thick foam on top. Foam was prized. Foam was beauty. Foam was status. The more abundant the froth, the more impressive the drink. This wasn't random kitchen theatrics. Foam symbolized breath, life force, even divine presence. In a culture where wind and breath were tied to spirit, that airy crown of bubbles mattered deeply. A cacao drink without froth was incomplete, almost disrespectful. And this drink was not for everyone. Elites consumed it daily. Kings drank it from painted ceramic vessels inscribed with their names and titles. Archaeologists have found cups labelled specifically for cacao use, decorated with scenes of courtly life and mythological imagery. To hold one was to hold identity. Commoners might encounter cacao only during festivals or special events. For them, it remained aspirational, a taste of the divine that hovered just out of reach, and again, it was bitter, sharp chili heat, earthy thickness. No sweetness to hide behind. The flavour would shock a modern palate expecting sugar and cream. But perhaps that was the point. This was not a drink meant for comfort. It was meant to awaken, to stimulate, to energize both body and mind. Cacao contains theobromine, a mild stimulant, not overwhelming like caffeine, but enough to quicken the pulse slightly. In royal courts, during negotiations or rituals, that mattered. Cacao was liquid authority, liquid prestige, liquid ritual. And the foam rising at the top was not decoration. It was the crown. If you wanted to understand power in the Maya world, you didn't just look at pyramids or armies, you looked at who was drinking cacao. In royal courts across cities like Tikal and Calakmul, cacao was more than a beverage. It was a symbol of authority. Kings did not simply rule, they performed rulership, and cacao was part of that performance. Ceramic vessels recovered from elite tombs tell us something fascinating. Many are painted with intricate scenes, rulers seated on thrones, attendants presenting offerings, gods hovering in mythic space. Along the rim of these cups, hieroglyphs often identify the vessel as a cacao container, specifically made for cacao. Some even name the owner. Imagine that level of personalization. A cup designed only for you. Your name wrapped around it. Your drink reserved within it. Cacao was served during diplomatic meetings, alliance ceremonies, and tribute presentations. When emissaries arrived from distant city-states, negotiations likely unfolded over bowls of frothy chocolate. Refusing cacao in such a setting would have been unthinkable, almost an insult. And the association ran deeper. In Maya mythology, rulers were intermediaries between gods and humans. Cacao, believed to have divine origins, reinforced that connection. When a king drank cacao, he wasn't merely refreshing himself. He was embodying sacred authority, participating in a ritual substance tied to creation and rebirth. Burial chambers strengthen this picture. In tombs across the Maya lowlands, archaeologists have found cacao residue inside vessels placed beside deceased nobles. Even in death, cacao accompanied them. It suggests the drink was considered necessary beyond this world, perhaps as sustenance, perhaps as status carried into the afterlife. And there's something quietly strategic about all of this. By controlling access to cacao through tribute systems and trade, elite rulers reinforced hierarchy. The drink became a visible marker of class. If you drank cacao regularly, you were powerful. If you rarely tasted it, you were not. This wasn't accidental. It was branding. Cacao was luxury. Cacao was ritual. Cacao was elite identity in liquid form. In the Maya court, chocolate was never casual. It was political theatre, served frothy. Cacao did not grow everywhere, and that limitation shaped the entire Maya world. The cacao tree thrives in hot, humid lowlands, particularly along river valleys and coastal plains. Regions in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize and Honduras became ideal growing zones. But major cities were not always located near those orchards. That meant one thing: trade. Cacao beans travelled far beyond the groves where they were harvested. They moved along established trade networks that connected dense jungle cities with highland settlements and coastal ports. Merchants carried them in woven sacks, alongside jade, obsidian blades, marine shells, bright quetzal feathers, and salt. And because cacao was lightweight yet valuable, it was perfect for long-distance exchange. Some cities, such as Tikal, depended heavily on imported cacao to sustain elite consumption. Others, closer to growing regions, could leverage cacao production for political advantage. Tribute systems often required subordinate communities to deliver cacao beans as part of their obligations to more powerful city-states. In this way, cacao became a strategic asset. It wasn't just a drink, it was leverage. Trade caravans moved along forest paths, rivers, and coastal routes. Canoes loaded with goods navigated waterways that functioned like highways through dense jungle terrain. Markets in urban centres buzzed with activity. Cacao could be exchanged for textiles, tools, food, or crafted goods. Its value was widely recognised, but here's the crucial detail. Because cacao beans were used as currency, they had to be counted, stored, and protected. There is evidence that counterfeit cacao, empty shells filled with dirt or carved substitutes, occasionally appeared. Even in the ancient world, people tried to game the system. That alone tells you how important cacao had become. And this trade system did more than circulate goods. It connected cultures. Ideas travelled with cacao. Religious imagery, artistic styles, and political alliances followed the same routes. Cacao was woven into the economic bloodstream of the Maya civilization. Where cacao flowed, influence followed. It sustained royal courts, fueled rituals, reinforced tribute hierarchies, and kept marketplaces alive. The humble bean, fragile and perishable, quietly linked cities across hundreds of miles of rainforest. Long before global commodity markets, cacao was already shaping economies. It was not just agriculture, it was infrastructure. If cacao moved through markets and courts, it also moved through myth. In the Maya worldview, the boundary between the human and divine was thin. Gods walked the earth in stories. Rulers embodied sacred forces. Crops were not just food, they were gifts from creation itself. And cacao occupied a place within that sacred landscape. One of the most important figures in Maya mythology is the maize god, a deity associated with fertility, rebirth, and cyclical renewal. Maize sustained physical life, but cacao, often depicted alongside maize in painted ceramics and carved reliefs, sustained ritual life. In some mythic traditions, cacao is discovered within a sacred mountain, a place of abundance guarded by divine forces. Only after divine intervention does it become accessible to humanity. That narrative alone frames cacao as something precious, something not casually possessed. It was not an everyday plant. It was a revelation. Scenes painted on Maya vases show gods presenting cacao to one another. In some depictions, cacao pods hang from the branches of the world tree, the cosmic axis connecting the underworld, the human realm, and the heavens. That symbolism is powerful. It ties cacao to cosmic order itself. And then there is the ritual context. Cacao was consumed during ceremonies marking births, marriages, alliances, and seasonal transitions. It may have been offered to deities during bloodletting rituals, ceremonies in which rulers drew their own blood to nourish the gods and reaffirm divine favour. In such settings, cacao was not refreshment, it was offering. Its froth, associated with breath and spirit, may have symbolized life essence rising upward. The bitterness of the drink perhaps mirrored sacrifice, sharp, intense, transformative. Even in funerary contexts, cacao appears again. Residue analysis from elite tomb vessels has confirmed the presence of cacao compounds. The dead were sent into the afterlife accompanied by cacao, suggesting it was considered necessary beyond earthly existence. To drink cacao was to align oneself with sacred history. To offer cacao was to participate in divine reciprocity. And what's fascinating is that this reverence persisted even as political systems shifted and cities rose or fell. Because cacao was not just tied to kings, it was tied to cosmology. Long before it became a global commodity, cacao was embedded in myth, ritual, and the sacred imagination of a civilization. It was not indulgence, it was divine inheritance. By now it's clear cacao wasn't casual. It wasn't something you sipped absent-mindedly while chatting about the weather. It showed up when things mattered. Take marriage. In many Maya communities, weddings were not just personal unions. They were alliances between families, sometimes even between noble houses. And cacao played a role in sealing those bonds. Historical accounts from later Mesoamerican traditions describe cacao being presented as part of bride wealth exchanges, offered symbolically to formalize the agreement. Imagine the scene. Two families gathered, tension hovering in the air, negotiations concluded. And then the cacao is served. Bitter, frothy, ceremonial. This wasn't dessert at the end of dinner. It was contract ink in liquid form. And then there were blood rituals. Maya rulers practiced auto-sacrifice, the drawing of their own blood using stingray spines or obsidian blades. It sounds extreme to us, but in their cosmology, blood nourished the gods and sustained cosmic balance. In some ritual contexts, cacao may have accompanied these ceremonies as an offering substance, reinforcing the sacred exchange between mortal and divine. Bitter cacao, human blood, rising incense. Not exactly a cozy cafe vibe, but the pairing makes symbolic sense. Cacao was energizing, stimulating. It heightened awareness. In intense ceremonial moments that mattered. It wasn't about comfort. It was about transformation. Cacao also appeared during coming-of-age rites and seasonal festivals. It marked thresholds, transitions, the crossing from one stage of life into another. To drink cacao during such a moment was to acknowledge that something sacred was unfolding. And here's the interesting part. Its bitterness may have been intentional. Modern chocolate is engineered for pleasure. Sugar softens the edge. Milk smooths the texture. But ancient cacao demanded attention. Chili heat lingered. The flavor was sharp, earthy, unapologetic. It tasted serious. And maybe that was the point. Rituals aren't meant to be sweet. They're meant to be memorable. So whether binding two families in marriage, accompanying blood offerings, or marking life's milestones, cacao was there. Not as indulgence, but as witness. A dark, frothy presence at the most important moments of life. In the Maya world, chocolate did not whisper romance. It declared covenant. Not everyone in the Maya world could casually sip cacao whenever they pleased. Access mattered. We often imagine ancient societies as either completely rigid or completely communal. But the reality was layered. Cacao sat near the top of that social pyramid. It was associated with rulers, nobles, priests, and warriors of status. If you were part of the elite, cacao was a regular presence in your life. If you were not, it was rare, maybe even unattainable. Archaeological evidence reinforces this divide. Elaborately painted cacao vessels are overwhelmingly found in elite burials and palace complexes. These were not simple clay cups. They were works of art, finely shaped, painted with mythological scenes, inscribed with hieroglyphs naming their owners. Owning such a vessel was itself a sign of power. Common households rarely yield the same decorated cacao ceramics. That doesn't mean ordinary people never tasted cacao. They likely did, especially during festivals or communal rituals. But daily consumption? That was a privilege, and privilege in ancient societies is rarely accidental. By controlling cacao production and distribution, elites reinforced hierarchy. Tribute systems required cacao payments from subordinate communities. The beans flowed upward toward royal centres, where they were consumed and displayed. The very act of drinking cacao became visible proof of status. Picture a ruler seated on a carved throne, attendants fanning him, a frothy cacao vessel placed in his hands. It's not subtle messaging. It says, "I have access to what is sacred. I command what is rare." Cacao also intersected with gender roles. Elite women, particularly noble women, likely consumed cacao in courtly settings. In some painted scenes, women are shown preparing or serving the drink. That act itself held prestige. Preparing cacao was not kitchen drudgery. It was participation in elite ritual culture. Meanwhile, farmers working cacao orchards may not have enjoyed the same level of access to the finished drink. They cultivated the sacred crop, but its highest expression belonged to others. There's a quiet irony in that. The bean grew from soil and sweat, but its frothy crown rose in palaces. Cacao wasn't just about flavor or ritual, it was about boundaries. Who belonged inside the circle of privilege and who remained outside. In the Maya world, chocolate was not democratic, it was hierarchical. For centuries, cacao remained deeply embedded in Mesoamerican life. It thrived under Maya cultivation, then continued under later civilizations like the Aztecs. It was still bitter, still spiced, still sacred. And then everything changed. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, they encountered cacao in royal courts and marketplaces. One of the most famous accounts comes from Hernán Cortés, who observed cacao being consumed by the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II. The drink was described as energizing and prestigious, served in golden cups. At first, the Spanish were unimpressed. The bitterness shocked them. The chilly heat confused them. This was not the sweet luxury we associate with chocolate today. It was intense, earthy, almost medicinal. But they noticed something else. Value. Cacao beans were still used as currency. They circulated in tribute systems. They fueled elite rituals. And crucially, they contained a stimulating effect that Europeans quickly appreciated on long journeys and military campaigns. So they brought cacao back across the Atlantic, and here is where transformation began. In Europe, sugar was added. Cinnamon replaced chili. Milk softened the bitterness. The sacred drink of kings was gradually turned into a sweet indulgence for aristocratic salons. What had once symbolized divine breath and ritual authority became fashionable among European elites. The meaning shifted. In Mesoamerica, cacao linked humans to gods. In Europe, chocolate became linked to luxury, refinement, and eventually mass production. By the time industrialization arrived centuries later, cacao was no longer a ceremonial elixir. It was a global commodity. But something was lost in that journey. The froth no longer symbolized sacred breath. The bitterness no longer carried ritual weight. The drink was no longer part of blood offerings or cosmic mythology. It was dessert. And yet, beneath every chocolate bar today lies that older story of trade routes through jungle cities, of hieroglyphs painted on cups, of rulers drinking frothy cacao in sacred courts. The world changed chocolate, but chocolate once shaped a civilization, and that origin still lingers faintly beneath the sweetness. Today, chocolate is comfort. It sits on supermarket shelves. It's melted into cakes. It's wrapped in foil and handed out on holidays. We associate it with sweetness, pleasure, even nostalgia. But if you strip away the sugar, if you taste high-percentage dark chocolate, sharp, earthy, almost confrontational, you catch a whisper of its original form. That bitterness is ancient. For the Maya, cacao was never about comfort. It was about meaning. It was currency that stabilized trade. It was ritual drink that marked marriages, blood ceremonies, and royal negotiations. It was divine inheritance woven into cosmology. It was class distinction served in painted vessels. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part. Very few foods in human history have carried so many layers at once: economic, political, spiritual, social. Cacao moved through jungle trade routes and palace courts. It sat in tombs beside the dead. It foamed in bowls during sacred rites. It symbolized both wealth and divine favor. When Europeans transformed cacao with sugar and milk, they didn't just change the flavor, they changed the philosophy. The drink shifted from sacred stimulant to sweet indulgence. Its edge softened, its symbolism thinned. But archaeology has a way of restoring depth. Chemical analysis of ancient ceramics confirms cacao residue in royal tombs. Painted glyphs explicitly name cacao as the contents of elite vessels. Murals depict its preparation and presentation. The evidence is not romantic speculation. It is material fact. And that matters. Because when we look at a modern chocolate bar, we're looking at the final chapter of a story that began in humid lowland orchards centuries ago. A story of farmers cultivating delicate pods, of merchants navigating forest trade routes, of kings raising frothy cups beneath temple pyramids. The sweetness we taste today is layered over something older and darker. Cacao was once sacred breath. It was ritual fire. It was political theatre. It was divine gift. So the next time you taste chocolate, especially the bitter kind, remember that you are not just tasting sugar and cocoa butter. You are tasting a civilization. Carnival was not just a party. It was a controlled explosion. In the weeks leading up to Lent, the solemn Christian season of fasting, prayer, and restraint, medieval Europe deliberately stepped into chaos. Because once Lent began, everything would tighten. Meat would vanish from plates. Laughter would soften. Pleasure would shrink under the weight of repentance. So before the fast came the feast. In cities like Venice, Cologne, and Paris, Carnival transformed the streets into something barely recognizable. Markets turned theatrical. Taverns overflowed. Church bells rang longer than usual. Masks appeared, simple cloth coverings or elaborate carved faces, allowing people to step outside their identities. And identity in the Middle Ages meant everything. Society was rigid. You were born into your place. Peasant, artisan, noble, cleric. Each role came with expectations and boundaries. Public defiance could be dangerous. Mocking authority was not normally wise, but during Carnival, the script flipped. Servants dressed as bishops. Students mocked professors. Ordinary townsfolk staged parodies of court rituals. Sometimes a mock king or lord of misrule was chosen to preside over festivities. A temporary ruler crowned for absurdity rather than legitimacy. For a few days the world ran backward. Drinking fueled the reversal. Ale flowed heavily. Wine casks were drained. Rich meats, soon to be forbidden during Lent, were eaten in excess. Pork, beef, sausages, eggs, butter. Everything indulgent was consumed before the fast stripped it away. The very word carnival likely echoes Carnival, farewell to meat. It was indulgence with urgency. But this chaos was not random rebellion. It was ritualized disorder. Authorities often tolerated it precisely because it was temporary. By allowing a pressure valve to open once a year, the system maintained itself the rest of the time. People laughed at power, briefly, then returned to obedience. Carnival was not freedom in the modern sense. It was a sanctioned inversion, a moment where masks hid faces, roles dissolved, and society pretended, just for a heartbeat, that hierarchy didn't exist. And then, as quickly as it rose, it would collapse back into order. If Carnival turned the world upside down, someone had to sit on the upside-down throne. Enter the Lord of Misrule. In many medieval towns, particularly in England and parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, a mock ruler was chosen to preside over the festivities. He might be a lower-ranking cleric, a guild member, or even a common labourer. For For a brief and chaotic stretch of days, he became the symbolic master of disorder. Orders were issued, absurd ones. Parades were staged. Songs were composed that mocked authority, sometimes in ways that would have been dangerous any other time of year. The Lord of Misrule represented the temporary suspension of seriousness. In England, especially during the late medieval period and into the Tudor era, this figure became central to holiday revelry. Even royal courts sometimes embraced the tradition. Under kings like Henry VIII, elaborate Christmas and pre-Lenten festivities included playful inversions of hierarchy. Courtiers dressed in disguise. Noblemen performed comic skits. Laughter filled halls that were otherwise defined by rigid etiquette. It was theatre. But beneath the humour lay something sharper. By crowning a mock ruler, society acknowledged, even if only symbolically, that power could be reversed. The peasant could command. The bishop could be mocked. The rigid structure of feudal life could bend. For a moment. Yet the Lord of Misrule was never meant to last. His authority was theatrical, not revolutionary. Once Carnival ended, he returned to his ordinary status. The peasant became a peasant again. The noble resumed command. The church reclaimed solemn authority as Lent began. The joke had an expiration date. Still, the symbolism mattered. In a world where upward mobility was nearly impossible, Carnival offered a fantasy of reversal. It allowed the imagination to stretch beyond daily reality. That release, even if temporary, helped preserve stability the rest of the year. Because once people had laughed at power safely, they were more willing to accept it seriously again. The Lord of Misrule did not threaten the system. He strengthened it by parody. Carnival's chaos was not anarchy. It was ritual rebellion, carefully timed, loudly celebrated, and always inevitably brought back under control. A mask changes everything. In the Middle Ages, identity was not flexible. Your clothes announced your class. Your speech revealed your trade. Even the cut of your hair could hint at your social rank. Laws known as sumptuary laws dictated who could wear silk, fur, bright dyes, or jewellery. Appearances reinforced hierarchy. Carnival shattered that clarity. During pre-Lenten celebrations, masks appeared in the streets. Simple linen coverings, painted wooden faces, animal disguises, grotesque expressions. In cities like Venice, masking traditions grew so elaborate that entire industries developed around crafting them. A masked figure could walk beside a nobleman without immediate recognition. A woman could speak more freely. A servant could mock his master in public. Anonymity created courage. When your face is hidden, your status blurs. And when status blurs, behaviour shifts. Jokes became sharper. Insults became louder. Satire cut deeper. Songs circulated that openly ridiculed clergy, mocked tax collectors, and exaggerated the greed of local elites. Under normal circumstances, such boldness could bring punishment. But Carnival offered temporary protection. This was not random lawlessness. It was ritualized disguise. Everyone understood the rules of the game. For a few days, laughter was permitted to cross lines that were otherwise rigid. Masks allowed people to act outside their assigned identities without permanently threatening the structure of society. Still, it could be dangerous. Authorities tolerated Carnival up to a point. When celebrations turned violent, or when satire crossed into genuine political agitation, crackdowns followed. Records from various towns show occasional arrests for excessive disorder. Chaos had limits, and yet the mask remained powerful. It symbolized transformation, not just hiding, but becoming someone else. A peasant might dress as a bishop, a merchant as a knight, a man as a woman. Gender roles, social boundaries, and moral expectations blurred in ways unthinkable during the rest of the year. The streets became a stage. Carnival revealed something profound about medieval life. Beneath the rigid hierarchy, there was imagination. There was humour. There was a desire to test the boundaries of authority, even if only safely. When the masks came off and Lent began, order returned. But for a few wild nights, the face beneath the mask tasted something rare. Freedom, borrowed, fleeting, and dangerously intoxicating. Carnival was not only about mockery and masks, it was about food, because once Lent began, indulgence would disappear from the table. For 40 days, Christians were expected to abstain from meat. In many regions, dairy, eggs, and rich animal fats were restricted as well. Meals became simpler. Discipline replaced indulgence. So before the fast came the feast. Households across medieval Europe used up perishable ingredients in spectacular fashion. Butter was churned into pastries, eggs were cracked into thick batters, pork was roasted, sausages sizzled, stews bubbled with fatty cuts of beef. It was a culinary farewell to excess. In France, the final day before Lent became known as Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday. The name says everything. It was the last chance to consume what would soon be forbidden. The same logic appeared elsewhere under different names, but the rhythm was consistent. Eat now, repent tomorrow. In towns and cities, public feasting intensified the atmosphere. Markets sold sweet fritters and spiced breads. Alehouses filled with customers determined to drink deeply before weeks of restraint. Wine flowed heavily. Even monasteries, usually models of discipline, marked the transition with notable meals before turning toward austerity. There was urgency in the air. This was not casual overeating. It was structured indulgence. People understood the calendar. They felt the approach of Lent like an approaching storm. Carnival offered warmth before the chill of denial. And yet, there was a spiritual logic beneath the gluttony. By fully indulging before the fast, believers sharpened the contrast. The deprivation of Lent felt more meaningful after abundance. The body remembered richness. The absence of meat and butter became a conscious sacrifice, rather than routine scarcity. In a world already accustomed to hardship, choosing to fast carried weight. Carnival amplified that choice. It was sensory overload before silence, noise before stillness, flavour before blandness, laughter before reflection. Then Ash Wednesday arrived. Ashes marked foreheads. Church bells slowed. The smell of roasted meat vanished from kitchens. Taverns quieted. The masks were stored away, and the same people who had feasted wildly just days before now bowed their heads in repentance. Carnival did not deny faith. It prepared the body to feel its absence. Carnival laughter was rarely gentle. It had teeth. During most of the medieval year, criticizing the church or local rulers openly could be dangerous. Blasphemy, sedition, or even simple disrespect toward authority might carry fines, imprisonment, or worse. The structure of power, king, noble, bishop, was reinforced constantly through ceremony and law. But Carnival bent that rule. Plays were staged in town squares that exaggerated the greed of tax collectors. Street performers mimicked priests with comically oversized rosaries. Satirical songs circulated that portrayed local officials as gluttons or fools. In some regions, mock trials were held, where animals or symbolic figures stood accused of absurd crimes. It was humour, but it was also commentary. One well-known example of ritual parody was the Feast of Fools, observed in parts of medieval France and elsewhere. Lower-ranking clergy temporarily assumed exaggerated authority, sometimes dressing in elaborate, even ridiculous costumes. Church interiors echoed with playful irreverence. Though controversial and often criticized by higher officials, these festivities persisted for centuries in various forms. Even sacred roles could be inverted. Imagine a young deacon presiding theatrically over a ceremony while senior clergy watched, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps amused. For a short time, sacred hierarchy loosened its grip. Why allow this? Because Carnival satire functioned as a pressure valve. By permitting structured mockery, society diffused resentment. People laughed at authority in a controlled environment, rather than rebelling violently outside it. It was safer to parody a bishop for a day than to challenge him for real. That does not mean tensions were imaginary. Medieval Europe faced heavy taxation, periodic famine, rigid class divisions, and strong ecclesiastical control. Frustration existed. Carnival gave it voice, carefully. Still, the mockery was rarely purely destructive. It was exaggerated, theatrical, symbolic. Once Lent began, the jokes stopped. Respect returned. Church services resumed solemn order. Carnival rebellion was temporary by design. But it revealed something crucial. Medieval people were not passive. They understood power structures. They saw hypocrisy. They noticed excess. And once a year, they expressed that awareness openly through laughter. When the final drumbeat faded and ashes replaced costumes, authority stood intact. But it stood slightly more human, because even kings and bishops had, for a brief moment, been the punchline. If Carnival had a heartbeat, it was rhythm. The streets during those pre-Lenten days did not sit quietly. They vibrated. Drums pounded against narrow stone walls. Fiddles shrieked. Pipes trilled. Bells clanged from towers and from handheld instruments carried by wandering performers. The air itself seemed restless. Music dissolved restraint. In daily medieval life, movement was purposeful. You walked to work, to church, to market. Dance existed, yes, but often in structured forms, guided by tradition. Carnival disrupted that order. Circles formed spontaneously in town squares. Strangers grabbed hands. Lines of dancers snaked through alleys. Movements became exaggerated, playful, sometimes deliberately crude. The body, usually disciplined by custom and morality, was briefly unleashed. In cities like Florence and Nuremberg, records describe elaborate processions filled with musicians and costumed participants. Guilds marched together behind banners. Youth groups staged noisy parades. Even clergy in certain places joined the singing, though perhaps with less enthusiasm for the chaos. The noise mattered. Sound signaled transition. It marked the boundary between ordinary time and carnival time. When drums echoed through stone streets, everyone knew something had shifted. The rhythm carried permission, and alcohol amplified it all. Ale loosened tongues. Wine blurred edges. As drinking intensified, dancing grew wilder. Some chronicles complain of excessive revelry, people stumbling through streets, shouting songs long after sunset. Authorities occasionally attempted to regulate the madness, issuing curfews or warnings. But enforcement during Carnival was often selective, because again, this was tolerated chaos. There was something almost ritualistic about the frenzy. Collective movement bound communities together. The same neighbours who worked quietly beside each other all year now shouted lyrics in unison. Social boundaries softened in shared rhythm. And then, as Lent approached, the tempo slowed. The drums quieted. The dancers dispersed. Taverns closed earlier. Silence returned like a curtain falling after a play. Carnival's music was not random noise. It was a temporary soundtrack to disorder. A reminder that beneath the solemn structure of medieval life pulsed something human. Loud, imperfect, and alive. For a few days, the body led. Then discipline reclaimed the stage. Carnival was permitted disorder. But permitted did not mean unlimited. Most years, the mockery, feasting, and drunkenness remained within understood boundaries. People knew the game. Laugh loudly, invert roles, drink deeply, then return to obedience when Lent began. But sometimes the game went too far. Crowds are unpredictable. Add alcohol, anonymity, and the thrill of reversed hierarchy, and the atmosphere could turn volatile. What began as satire could become aggression. What started as parody could spill into real insult. In some medieval towns, carnival festivities escalated into street fights between rival guilds. Youth groups used the chaos as an opportunity to settle grudges. Property damage occurred. Windows shattered. Market stalls overturned. Chroniclers occasionally recorded injuries, even deaths, linked to unruly celebrations. Authorities tolerated inversion, but not insurrection. If mockery began to target specific officials in ways that felt politically threatening, tolerance evaporated quickly. Town councils imposed fines. Guards dispersed crowds. Certain costumes or performances were banned in later years. In extreme cases, entire carnival traditions were temporarily suppressed. The church, too, expressed unease. While carnival preceded Lent and was embedded in the Christian calendar, its excess often contradicted the spiritual seriousness that Lent represented. Some bishops condemned particularly irreverent practices, especially those that mocked sacred rituals too closely. The tension between joy and blasphemy was thin, yet suppression rarely lasted long. Carnival kept returning, because despite the occasional violence, medieval society recognized something essential. Without release, pressure builds. The rigid hierarchies of feudal life required occasional loosening. If people were denied symbolic rebellion, resentment might seek other outlets, more dangerous ones. So authorities learned to manage carnival rather than eliminate it. Rules were refined, processions were supervised, certain performances were guided by guild structures. Controlled chaos replaced spontaneous riot. Still, the edge remained. Carnival was never entirely safe. It flirted with disorder every year. It walked a line between ritual inversion and genuine upheaval. And that tension gave it power. Because beneath the laughter and dancing lay a deeper truth. Society knew it was fragile. It knew hierarchy could be challenged. It knew obedience was not automatic. Carnival allowed that truth to surface briefly, then gently pushed it back beneath the surface. Chaos knocked on the door, but it was always escorted out before morning. Carnival did not fade slowly. It stopped. One night the streets roared with laughter, masks, drums, and spilled wine. The next morning, ashes marked foreheads. Ash. Wednesday arrived with startling contrast. Priests pressed dark crosses of ash onto bowed heads, whispering reminders of mortality. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The same faces that had shouted songs now stood in silence. The same mouths that devoured meat and wine now prepared for abstinence. The shift was intentional. Carnival was never meant to exist without Lent. One fed the other. Excess sharpened the discipline that followed. Without indulgence, fasting would feel ordinary. Without chaos, repentance would lack weight. The medieval calendar understood rhythm. Markets that had overflowed with rich foods now offered simpler fare. Taverns grew quieter. Public performances ceased. Music retreated behind closed doors. In many regions, weddings were postponed during Lent. Even clothing colours became more subdued. The body that had danced wildly now knelt. But something lingered. Carnival did not erase hierarchy permanently, yet it left a memory. People returned to their roles having briefly stepped outside them. A peasant who mocked a lord under a mask would not forget the feeling entirely. A bishop who had endured parody might remember the vulnerability. The system resumed, but it had flexed, and perhaps that flexibility was part of its survival. Medieval life was demanding. Disease, war, famine, rigid social structure. The pressures were constant. Carnival and Lent together created emotional balance. One released tension, the other restored discipline. Together, they formed a cycle that shaped the year. There is something almost psychological about it. By staging chaos before repentance, society acknowledged human appetite for pleasure, laughter, rebellion, without permanently surrendering control. It recognized weakness and ritualized it rather than pretending it did not exist. And so the masks were stored. The Lord of Misrule returned to anonymity. Meat vanished from plates. Wine was rationed. Prayer replaced parody. But everyone knew. When the next year approached and Lent drew near again, the drums would return. The streets would fill. The world would flip upside down once more. Because order, in the Middle Ages, depended on remembering how to lose it, briefly. For something so chaotic, Carnival proved remarkably durable. Empires rose and fell. Plagues tore through Europe. Wars reshaped borders. Reform movements split the church. And yet, in many regions, Carnival endured, sometimes suppressed, sometimes reshaped, but never entirely erased. Why? Because Carnival was not just noise and drunkenness. It answered a human need. Medieval life was structured by obligation, to lord, to land, to guild, to God. The calendar itself was sacred, marking saints' days, fasts, and holy seasons. People lived inside rhythms imposed from above. Carnival offered one brief counter-rhythm, a space where emotion, humour, appetite, and imagination surged forward. It did not destroy the system. It refreshed it. Even when authorities attempted to clamp down, especially during more reform-minded periods when church leaders sought stricter moral discipline, Carnival often adapted rather than disappeared. Costumes became less irreverent. Parodies softened. Celebrations were regulated. But the core remained. A final burst of indulgence before Lent. Cities like Venice transformed Carnival into elaborate masked pageantry that balanced spectacle with control. In German lands, guilds formalized processions. In France, Mardi Gras traditions solidified into established community rituals. Carnival proved flexible. It could be wild or refined, crude or theatrical, rural or urban. Its form shifted depending on local culture and political pressure, but its purpose, release before restraint, stayed intact. And that pattern speaks to something larger than medieval Europe. Human societies, especially structured ones, require sanctioned spaces where norms loosen. Without that outlet, tension hardens. Carnival functioned as a cultural reset button. It allowed laughter at power without revolution. It permitted gluttony without permanent moral collapse. It acknowledged weakness without abandoning faith. Then, Lent restored order. The brilliance of Carnival was not its chaos. It was its timing. The excess was carefully placed. The rebellion had a deadline. The masks always came off. That predictability made it safe enough to survive. Because in the end, Carnival was never about overthrowing authority. It was about reminding everyone, rulers and peasants alike, that beneath hierarchy, beneath discipline, beneath solemn ritual, there remained something irrepressibly human. And once a year, it demanded to be heard. Then it bowed its head in ashes. Alchemy in the Middle Ages was not just early science. It was hunger, intellectual, spiritual, and very often financial. At its most famous, alchemy revolved around a dazzling promise, the transmutation of base metals into gold. Imagine it, taking dull, heavy lead and transforming it into something radiant and incorruptible. No mines, no conquest, no taxation, just transformation. In a world where wealth meant power, that idea was explosive. Gold was stability. Gold funded wars, built cathedrals, secured marriages, and bought loyalty. To create it artificially would overturn the economic order. It is no surprise that kings occasionally funded alchemists, cautiously, hoping for impossible profit. But here's what makes medieval alchemy more fascinating than simple greed. The quest for gold was symbolic. Alchemists believed metals were not static substances. They were living entities inside the earth, slowly evolving over time. Base metals were considered immature, while gold represented perfection, fully ripened matter. The alchemist's task was not to cheat nature, but to accelerate it. In this worldview, transformation was natural. It just needed guidance. This is where the philosopher's stone entered the story, a legendary substance said to enable transmutation. With it, lead could become gold. But the stone was more than a metal-making tool. It was believed to grant wisdom, spiritual enlightenment, and even immortality in the form of the elixir of life. Gold and eternal life, in one formula. That combination explains the obsession. Medieval Europe inherited alchemical ideas from earlier traditions, Greek, Egyptian, and especially Islamic scholars. Texts attributed to figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan circulated in Latin translation, blending experiment with mysticism. Knowledge travelled across cultures, often cloaked in symbolism. Because alchemy was rarely written plainly, its texts were filled with coded language, strange symbols, and allegories involving kings, queens, dragons, and rebirth. Recipes were hidden inside poetry, instructions disguised as myth. Was it science? Was it magic? In truth, it was both, and neither. Alchemy was the medieval attempt to understand matter, spirit, and perfection at once. The dream of turning lead into gold was not only about wealth, it was about mastering transformation itself. If gold was the prize, the philosopher's stone was the key. Medieval alchemists did not agree on its exact form. Some described it as a red powder. Others imagined a waxy substance, a crystalline stone, or a glowing elixir. Its appearance mattered less than its power. The stone was said to perfect whatever it touched. Base metal into gold, sickness into health, mortality into immortality. That final promise made it irresistible. The philosopher's stone was believed to produce the elixir of life, a substance capable of healing disease and extending human lifespan indefinitely. In an age of plague, famine, and short life expectancy, such a promise bordered on divine intervention. But the stone was not simply a magical object. It represented completion. Alchemy operated on the belief that matter and spirit were connected. The external transformation of metal mirrored an internal transformation of the soul. To create the philosopher's stone, the alchemist himself had to be purified. Impurities in character were thought to corrupt the process. Greed, impatience, arrogance. These could derail the work. In other words, the laboratory was also a spiritual test. Texts often described the stone's creation through stages: blackening, whitening, reddening, symbolic phases of decay, purification, and perfection. These stages were sometimes represented as death and rebirth. Dragons devoured themselves. Kings were dissolved and resurrected. It read like myth because it was meant to be layered, literal and symbolic at once. Some medieval thinkers treated the stone cautiously. Church authorities occasionally viewed alchemy with suspicion, fearing fraud or heresy. Yet it was never entirely condemned. In fact, certain scholars engaged with it seriously. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon were associated, rightly or wrongly, with alchemical inquiry. The line between theology, philosophy, and early science was thin. The stone became a kind of intellectual magnet. It drew in mystics, physicians, experimenters, and opportunists alike. Some truly sought wisdom, others sought quick wealth. Most found neither. Yet the idea endured, because it offered something extraordinary: the possibility that imperfection could be transformed, that decay could become brilliance. The philosopher's stone was less about rocks and more about hope. Hope that matter, and perhaps humanity itself, could be perfected. Alchemy did not unfold in glittering halls of gold. It happened in cramped rooms filled with smoke. The medieval alchemist's workspace was closer to a workshop than a wizard's tower. Furnaces roared day and night. Crucibles cracked under heat. Glass vessels, alembics, retorts, flasks, sat over coals while strange vapours rose into the air. The smell was sharp: sulphur, mercury, burning charcoal, and metal. This was not poetry. It was experiment. Alchemists heated metals, dissolved substances in acids, distilled liquids, and carefully recorded results, though rarely in straightforward language. They were among the first in Europe to refine laboratory techniques that would later become foundational to chemistry: distillation, sublimation, calcination, crystallization. Many failed repeatedly. Metals melted into useless slag. Explosions were not uncommon. Toxic fumes caused illness. Mercury, central to many alchemical theories, slowly poisoned those who handled it carelessly. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and often financially ruinous. Because experimentation required materials. Metals, minerals, glassware, fuel, all cost money. And since success was rare, many alchemists relied on wealthy patrons to fund their research. Nobles and princes sometimes financed laboratories in hopes of gold. Some rulers even employed court alchemists, giving them space and resources in exchange for potential breakthroughs. But this arrangement created tension. If gold did not appear quickly, suspicion followed. Alchemists risked accusations of fraud. Some were imprisoned. Others were expelled from courts once patience ran out. Secrecy became protection. Knowledge was guarded closely. Recipes were encoded. Diagrams included cryptic symbols representing elements and processes. A serpent might symbolize mercury. A lion devouring the sun could represent chemical dissolution. Without guidance, texts were nearly unreadable. This obscurity served two purposes. First, it protected genuine experimentation from theft or misuse. Second, it concealed failure. If the language was mysterious enough, disappointment could be reframed as deeper symbolism. And yet, beneath the smoke and metaphor, something real was happening. Trial and error, observation, refinement. Alchemy blurred the line between mysticism and method, but its laboratories laid groundwork for later scientific development. Even unsuccessful attempts produced knowledge about materials and reactions. Gold may have remained elusive, but the furnace forged something else, the early foundations of experimental science. And in rooms thick with vapour and ambition, the dream continued to burn. If you opened a medieval alchemy manuscript expecting clear instructions, you would be disappointed. Instead of direct recipes, you found riddles. Kings marrying queens, dragons devouring themselves, suns swallowed by lions, black crows turning white, then red. At first glance, it reads like fantasy, but to the alchemist, it was instruction, carefully hidden. Alchemy thrived on symbolism. Partly this was practical. Openly claiming the ability to create gold could attract unwanted attention from authorities, rivals, or desperate patrons. Encoding knowledge offered protection. But there was another reason. Alchemists believed transformation was not purely physical. It was spiritual. So their texts reflected that dual nature. The black stage, often called nigredo, symbolized decay, the breakdown of matter. Substances were heated, burned, reduced to ash. But symbolically, it represented death of the ego, the alchemist confronting his own impurities. Next came albedo, whitening, purification, cleansing, then rubedo, reddening, completion, perfection, the birth of the philosopher's stone. These stages were described through imagery because the process itself was seen as sacred. Literal and metaphorical transformation were intertwined. A famous text known as the Emerald Tablet, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, summarized the philosophy in cryptic phrases, as above, so below. The idea suggested a mirrored relationship between the cosmos and the material world. What happened in the flask echoed what happened in the soul. Alchemy was never just about metals, it was about unity. The belief that matter, spirit, and the universe followed the same hidden laws. This symbolic language made alchemy alluring, but also frustrating. Outsiders mocked it. Some church authorities tolerated it cautiously, others distrusted its mystical tone. To skeptics, the dragons and crowned suns looked like nonsense, but to believers, they were maps. A dragon devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros, symbolized eternal cycles. A king dissolving in water symbolized metal breaking down in acid. The imagery was layered, meant to be decoded only by the initiated. It created exclusivity. Alchemy was not mass knowledge. It was apprenticeship, secrecy, mentorship. Understanding required guidance, and in that coded world of symbols and smoke, alchemists believed they were uncovering the architecture of creation itself, not by plain instruction, but by hidden truth. For every alchemist searching sincerely for transformation, there was another chasing gold. And kings noticed. Medieval rulers were perpetually short on money. Wars drained treasuries, Cathedrals required funding. Court life was expensive. The idea that a skilled alchemist might produce gold in a furnace rather than in a mine was irresistible, so they sponsored experiments. Across Europe, princes and monarchs invited alchemists to court. Some were given laboratories within castles. Furnaces were installed behind thick stone walls. Supplies were provided. In return, the ruler expected results. Gold, ideally. But gold rarely appeared. And when it did appear, or seemed to, suspicion followed. There were countless accusations of trickery. Some alchemists were exposed as frauds, secretly adding small amounts of gold to crucibles to simulate transmutation. Others manipulated wealthy patrons with vague promises and endless delays. The line between visionary and con artist was thin. Certain rulers eventually banned alchemical practices outright, fearing counterfeit coinage or economic destabilization. In England, for example, laws were passed at various points restricting the multiplication of metals without royal permission. Because if anyone could create gold, currency would collapse. Yet despite skepticism, patronage continued. Why? Because even if transmutation failed, alchemists often possessed genuine technical skill. Their knowledge of metallurgy, mineral processing, and chemical reactions was valuable. Court-sponsored laboratories sometimes improved metal refinement or medicinal preparations, even if they never produced the philosopher's stone. Some alchemists navigated the tension carefully. Figures like Nicholas Flamel later became legendary for supposedly achieving transmutation and immortality. Whether these stories were true or myth hardly mattered. They fueled the imagination of generations. Royal courts became stages where ambition, mysticism, and greed intersected. A desperate king might overlook failure longer than reason allowed. An ambitious alchemist might promise more than evidence supported. The atmosphere was volatile. Still, the dream persisted, because gold symbolized more than wealth. It symbolized mastery over nature itself. If matter could be perfected in a furnace, perhaps humanity could be perfected too. Even when fraud surfaced, even when furnaces cooled, the idea refused to die. Alchemy walked a dangerous path between genius and deception, and courts across Europe were willing, at least for a time, to gamble on the possibility that fire could make kings richer. Alchemy existed in a world dominated by faith. The medieval church shaped education, morality, law, and intellectual life. Any practice claiming hidden knowledge about nature risked scrutiny. And alchemy, with its talk of secret stones, immortality, and transformation, naturally raised eyebrows. Was it divine insight or dangerous hubris? The answer was complicated. Alchemy was never officially classified as outright heresy in the way certain mystical sects were. In fact, many alchemists were themselves devout Christians. They framed their work as an exploration of God's creation, not a rebellion against it. To understand matter was to understand the divine craftsmanship behind it. Some theologians even embraced alchemical symbolism. The process of death and rebirth in the furnace mirrored Christian themes of crucifixion and resurrection. The purification of metals resembled the purification of the soul. Transformation was already embedded in Christian doctrine: water into wine, bread into body, mortal into eternal. From that perspective, alchemy felt almost theological. Yet, suspicion lingered. The promise of creating gold could tempt fraud. The search for immortality could appear to challenge divine authority. Church leaders occasionally warned against deceptive practitioners who exploited superstition. And whenever alchemy crossed into overt magic or occult ritual, condemnation followed quickly. Still, the intellectual atmosphere of the High Middle Ages was surprisingly fluid. Universities were emerging. Scholars studied Aristotle through Arabic translations. Natural philosophy, what we would call science, developed within church institutions. Alchemy slipped into that broader conversation about how the natural world functioned. Even prominent thinkers were associated with it. Thomas Aquinas addressed alchemical transmutation in his writings, debating whether artificially produced gold would truly count as gold. His concern was philosophical, not hysterical. Could humans alter the essence of matter or only its appearance? That question reveals something important. Alchemy forced medieval scholars to grapple with the nature of substance, form, and change. It was not only about furnaces, it was about metaphysics. So alchemy survived within Christian Europe because it adapted. It cloaked itself in spiritual language. It avoided direct defiance of doctrine. It presented itself as reverent inquiry rather than rebellion. The furnace burned under the shadow of the cathedral. And as long as it did not claim to replace God, it was allowed to search for his secrets in fire and metal. Alchemy was not only about gold. For many practitioners, the more urgent question was survival. Medieval Europe was a landscape of disease. Plague outbreaks, infections, poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge meant that life expectancy was short and fragile. In this context, the alchemical promise of an elixir of life was not abstract fantasy. It was desperate hope. If the philosopher's stone could perfect metals, perhaps it could perfect flesh. Alchemists experimented with distillation, extracting concentrated essences from plants and minerals. They believed that every substance contained a hidden spirit or vital force. Through careful heating and purification, that essence could be separated and harnessed. Alcohol distillation, refined significantly during the medieval period, was one such breakthrough. Known as aqua vitae, water of life, distilled spirits were believed to possess medicinal power. They were used to preserve herbs, clean wounds, and treat illness. This blending of alchemy and medicine gave rise to new approaches to healing. One of the most influential figures in this tradition was Paracelsus, though he lived slightly after the medieval period. He rejected some traditional medical theories and emphasized chemical remedies, arguing that illness could be treated with precisely prepared compounds. His work reflected a shift. Alchemy began moving from mystical transmutation toward practical chemistry applied to the human body. Mineral-based treatments, tinctures, and purified extracts entered medical practice. While some remedies were toxic or misguided, others laid groundwork for pharmacology. The alchemist's laboratory became not just a furnace room, but a pharmacy. Still, danger remained. Mercury, arsenic, sulfur, substances central to alchemical theory, were also poisonous. The line between medicine and toxin was thin. Dosing was inconsistent. Understanding of long-term effects was limited. Yet the intent mattered. Many alchemists genuinely sought healing, not wealth. They believed the same principles governing metal transformation applied to the body. Disease was imbalance. Cure required purification. This mindset reshaped medical thinking. The dream of immortality may have remained unreachable, but alchemical experimentation contributed to evolving ideas about chemistry, extraction, and chemical interaction within the body. Gold was dazzling, but survival was urgent. And in smoky laboratories filled with glass vessels and bubbling liquids, alchemists chased not only wealth, but life itself. By the late Middle Ages, something subtle was happening. Alchemy was beginning to change. For centuries, its language had been mystical. Dragons, kings, sacred stones. Its goals had been grand. Gold, immortality, perfection. But beneath the symbolism, alchemists had been doing something more practical all along. They were experimenting, heating substances, measuring reactions, observing changes, recording outcomes, even if in coded form. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain acids dissolved metals reliably. Distillation separated liquids predictably. Minerals reacted in consistent ways. Gradually, attention shifted from mythic transmutation to material behavior. The furnace remained, but the focus sharpened. In universities and workshops, scholars began to emphasize observation over allegory. Texts became slightly clearer. Processes were described with more precision. The idea that matter could be studied systematically, without invoking dragons, gained strength. This transition did not happen overnight. Alchemy and early chemistry overlapped for centuries, but the seeds of scientific method were present in alchemical practice. Repetition mattered. Failure was analysed. Tools were refined. Glassware improved. Weighing and measuring became more deliberate. The mystical language slowly lost dominance. By the time thinkers like Robert Boyle emerged in the 17th century, the shift was undeniable. Boyle criticised vague alchemical traditions while building upon their experimental groundwork. He demanded clearer definitions of elements and compounds. He pushed for transparency instead of secrecy. Yet without alchemy, that evolution would have been impossible. The laboratory culture, furnaces, retorts, controlled heating, originated in alchemical spaces. Even the term chemistry grew out of earlier alchemical traditions. What changed was intention. The search for gold faded. The search for knowledge intensified. Mysticism gave way to measurement. That does not mean alchemists were foolish. On the contrary, they were transitional figures. They bridged worlds, ancient philosophy, medieval theology, and emerging science. They made mistakes, yes, they chased illusions, but they also observed carefully. Alchemy was the language available to them. Chemistry became the language that followed. The philosopher's stone never materialized, but something else did. A disciplined way of studying matter, born from centuries of smoke, ambition, and the relentless human desire to understand how transformation truly works. No one ever proved they made gold from lead. No verified philosopher's stone was passed down through history. No confirmed elixir of life granted eternal youth to a medieval king. By those measures, alchemy failed. And yet, it did not vanish. Because alchemy was never only about metal. At its core, it was about transformation. Medieval alchemists believed the world was not fixed. Matter could change. The impure could become pure. The base could become noble. That belief, radical in its time, reshaped how people thought about nature. It suggested that the universe operated through hidden processes that could be uncovered through study and discipline. Even when their theories were flawed, their mindset endured. The idea that substances could be broken down, recombined, and altered laid intellectual groundwork for modern chemistry. Laboratory techniques refined in alchemical workshops became standard scientific tools. Distillation, filtration, controlled heating. These were not myths. They were practical innovations. But alchemy's legacy extends beyond science. Its symbolism influenced art and literature for centuries. The image of the alchemist bent over a glowing furnace, searching, failing, trying again, became a metaphor for human striving. The philosopher's stone transformed from a literal object into a symbol of inner enlightenment. Even modern language carries echoes of it. We speak of personal transformation, of turning struggles into gold, of finding the elixir for problems. These are alchemical metaphors, quietly surviving in everyday speech. Alchemy also represents something psychologically powerful. It embodies the refusal to accept limits. In a harsh medieval world, where death was frequent and knowledge incomplete, alchemists dared to imagine mastery over decay itself. They believed imperfection was temporary, not permanent. That hope matters. Was there fraud? Certainly. Was there delusion? Absolutely. But there was also curiosity. Persistent, stubborn, experimental curiosity. Alchemy stood at the crossroads of mysticism and method, greed and genius, illusion and insight. It failed to make gold, but it helped forge science. It failed to create immortality, but it left behind a legacy that still shapes how we understand matter, change, and possibility. In the end, the true philosopher's stone was not hidden in a crucible. It was the idea that transformation is possible, in metal, in knowledge, and in ourselves.